Previously on the Criminalish podcast.
Even after Satchidananda's death in 2002, Integral Yoga and Yogaville maintained a good online presence. It was actually fairly difficult to find a lot of negative criticism and deep dives about the connection between Yogaville and cult-like behavior. And you would actually see a lot more pushback against this idea on forums, in comment threads, in Reddit threads, all of that. So it's not just Integral Yoga Institute having an online presence. Yogaville's members also have an online presence. In October 2022, that started to change a little bit, because that's when Integral Yoga made a post titled "Facts and Allegations Concerning the Late Swami Satchidananda." They contend that, though hearing about the sexual assault allegations has been difficult for everyone, seemingly including those who don't believe in them, because Satchidananda is dead, they cannot make any statement about what happened. Quote, "It is not possible for the organization to make a statement on his behalf or to definitively comment about consensual relationships or allegations of comments of a sexual nature or sexual advances that are alleged to have occurred 30 to 50 years ago." End quote. As part of this statement, they announced that they would be expanding their code of conduct policy. They got pushed again when a former Yogaville member named Shanti Norris sent 2 letters to the Integral Yoga Board in January and July of 2022. She actually says that these were what likely caused the board to release their own statement regarding the sexual assault allegations and their change to the code of conduct. Her first letter asked them to acknowledge the claims of sexual assault against Swami Satchidananda as a board, and the second letter described in detail the relationship she had with him, something she had not previously done outside of friends and family.
Yogaville has remained in the public eye, and it has not run away from the public eye. However, that would quickly change as the narrative around Yogaville starts to take a hard turn in 2023. As in 2023, Yogaville starts to face legal ramifications for the allegations that came out in the 90s. On November 17th, 2023, plaintiffs Susan Cohen and Sharon Norris filed a lawsuit in the Supreme Court of the State of New York against the defendants Integral Yoga Institute and Satchidananda Ashram Yogaville Incorporated.
Hi, I'm Cam.
And I'm Dev.
And you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where 2 best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up. Welcome to part 3 of our Yogaville series. Last time, we discussed Yogaville's media presence, their changes to the code of conduct, and the initial parts of the 2023 lawsuit against Yogaville.
So again, just like last time, Cam and I won't be doing a deep recap of what happened in part 1 or part 2, but we will be doing minimal recap as necessary throughout the rest of the episode. If you haven't listened to part 1 or part 2, I don't really know how you got here. It's okay. But I have left links to both of them in the description box, so you should really go check that out and go listen to part 1 and part 2 so that you understand what's going on here. Because we went over a lot of information that is going to be very, very important for this final episode. And the only thing that we will be reiterating in this episode is our definition of a cult, as well as important information about cult psychology. So as your reminder, Cam and I will use the following definition for a cult. A cult is a social group defined by its religious, spiritual, or philosophical beliefs, practices, or devotion to a specific leader, object, or ideology, often considered unorthodox or outside of mainstream society. Typically led by a charismatic figure who claims special knowledge or divine authority, cults foster unwavering loyalty among followers. Their beliefs are often presented as the sole path to truth, salvation, or enlightenment, reinforcing dependence on the group, while distancing members from the outside world. Members are also expected to devote significant time, energy, and financial resources to the group, often at the expense of personal relationships and well-being. Cults also maintain secrecy, restricting access to core teachings and rituals until members demonstrate a certain level of commitment, fostering a sense of superiority through their perceived exclusive knowledge.
Like Dev said, we're also going to reiterate important points about cult psychology. We specifically discussed the psychology of cult leaders and followers. For cult leaders, researchers often see the dark triad of psychological traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Cult followers, on the other hand, are pretty demographically and psychologically diverse. However, researchers have noted that people are more susceptible to cults when they're going through significant life changes or dealing with intense depression, guilt, or anger.
So before we pick up where we left off and get back into all things Yogaville, what you drinking, Fran?
So, friend, I am drinking an Italian rosé called Frexinette.
Called what now, Fran? What was it called?
It looked like Frexinette or Frexinette. It is spelled Freixenet. Frexinette.
Sounds like Frexinette to me.
Exactly.
We just pissed off our entire Italian audience. I'm gonna let you know.
If anybody in our audience is Italian or speaks Italian, please let us know the correct pronunciation in the comments.
Yes, the phonetic spelling would be appreciated. Please and thank you.
Yes. But what you drinking, friend?
Friend, I am back with another brown sugar boba milk tea. I promise this won't be like last season where I had it for like half of the episodes. I promise it won't. It'll just be these two. I promise. I promise right now. Scout's honor or whatever it is. I don't know. I was never a scout.
For our audio listeners, Dev just held up all of her fingers and let one down one by one. So not only have we offended our Italian listeners, we've also offended any listeners who were in or affiliated with the Boy Scouts. We're off to a really good start.
Absolutely, friend. And that's just the perfect segue to allow us to jump right back into a deep conversation about cults. So anyway, when we last left off, we had finished covering the civil lawsuits of Sharon and Susan against Yogaville. And I left you with the cliffhanger that Yogaville actually filed a countersuit against Susan and Sharon for tortious interference with business relationships, as well as libel and slander. Now, unfortunately for us, I was not able to find Yogaville's counterclaim, but luckily Sharon and Susan's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss these counterclaims, arguing they constituted a strategic lawsuit against public participation, or a SLAPP suit. And the Supreme Court of New York has already ruled on this motion as of December 17th, 2024, so relatively recently, and we have their response, which mentions the allegations that were in Yogaville's counterclaim. So, according to the Supreme Court decision, quote, defendants' counterclaims essentially argue that the allegations of sexual assault are lies, and therefore any public statement to the effect amounts to defamation. They also claim that the allegations of sexual assault are a conspiratorial attempt to financially impact the Institute. Plaintiffs argue in the present motion that defendants' counterclaims are a SLAPP suit, and they oppose the cross motion to replead the verified answer, end quote. The ruling continues, and the court agrees with the plaintiffs that the defendants' counterclaims present a, quote, classic SLAPP suit scenario, end quote. So for those of you who don't know, SLAPP, which is spelled SLAPP, stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. A SLAPP suit is characterized as having little legal merit, but is filed to burden opponents with legal costs and discourage future speech. Because of this, many states have what is called anti-SLAPP laws that protect people from being sued for exercising their First Amendment rights and allows defendants to use anti-SLAPP laws to quickly dismiss lawsuits that are meritless and recover their attorney's fees and cost. This essentially keeps mega powers and corporations from silencing their critics with money, as major corporations have more money for litigation than the average person does. So Sharon and Susan's attorneys filed an anti-slap motion after Yogaville filed their obvious slap motion claiming defamation. So now that you have that background, let's get back into the Supreme Court decision. The decision goes on to explain exactly what slap is and explains what other judges have done to make similar judgments in the past. The decision then goes on to examine specific claims made in the counterclaim by Yogaville, including torturous interference. They begin with Susan Cohen, stating, quote, "Defendants have a rather conclusory statement that Cohen has been spreading venomous allegations about the organization and Swami Satchidananda through her husband, but that is not enough for a valid claim. It is Cohen, not her husband, that defendants have counterclaimed for torturous interference. Defendants have cited to no case law that would hold Cohen responsible for alleged statements by her husband in a tortious interference claim. Even taking the allegations in the counterclaim as true, as is the standard on a motion to dismiss, the claim is time barred and therefore dismissal of the first counterclaim is proper," end quote. So the court found the torturous interference claim against Susan Cohen to be time barred, as the alleged actions dated back to 1991 and 2002. And in legal terms, time barred just means that the time where someone is allowed to bring a legal action against someone in a civil case has passed. The decision goes on to reveal Yogaville makes similar claims against Sharon Norris, stating, quote, "Defendant's basis for the counterclaim is that Norris, quote, and her surrogates, conspirators, and collaborators organized an attack on the Institute through various websites and social media platforms," end quote. Alleged actions that also form the basis for the defamation counterclaims. The only statement attributed to Norris in the tortious interference counterclaim are also statements that defendants pled in the defamation counterclaim. While, assuming the facts pled in the papers are true, certain emails and communications with third parties could form the basis of a tortious interference claim. Once again, it is not the plaintiff, Norris, who made such statements, but individuals not party to this action. Defendants have not cited any case law that would support a valid claim against Norris for the actions of others. A defendant in a tortious interference claim must have acted with, quote, "wrongful means," end quote, which includes, quote, "some degree of economic pressure, but more than simple persuasion is required." Defendants here allege that Norris and others, quote, "colluded," end quote, but fails to allege why Norris would have vicarious liability for the actions of others beyond conclusory allegations of a conspiracy, end quote. The ruling goes on to say, quote, "Both counterclaims for defamation are largely pled with conclusory allegations and unspecific statements such as, quote, plaintiff Norris collaborated, colluded, and conspired to disseminate false accusation of sexual abuse when she knew those allegations were false," end quote. It is important to note that the defamation counterclaims are brought by the Institute and its managing corporation, and not the estate of Satchidananda. A prima facie case of defamation must establish that the, quote, "matter published is of and concerning," end quote, the plaintiffs. Statements directed towards a business entity are not of and concerning the organization's employees. The reverse is also true. Therefore, statements to the effect that Satchidananda committed sexual assault would not give rise to a defamation counterclaim in this case, but statements to the effect that the defendants played some role in covering up or otherwise facilitating such alleged assaults could. Here, when the complaint points to specific statements regarding the defendants and not Satchidananda as an individual, even giving defendants every possible favorable inference, such statements do not give rise to prima facie claim for defamation. Defendants allege that Cohen referred to them as a, quote, cult, end quote, in 1991 and 2002, both instances of which are time barred for defamation. They also allege that, quote, Norris has instigated a public relations campaign against defendants and has gone on a public radio station in Virginia with wide circulation to attack defendants and state that they were responsible for causing her to be sexually assaulted, end quote. The issue with this statement is that it is not pled with the requisite specificity to support prima facie claim of defamation. Because the third and fourth counterclaims were not pled with particularity, they fail to state a valid claim and therefore dismissal is proper, end quote. So to summarize all of that, essentially the court is heavily scrutinizing the defendants, aka Integral Yoga, aka Integral Yoga's defamation counterclaims for lacking the requisite particularity that is required when filing for claims of defamation. The decision emphasizes that a defamation claim must allege, quote, the time, place, and manner of the false statement and specify to whom it was made, end quote, which again, the court calls out for lacking in this case. Furthermore, the court pointed out that statements about Swami Satchidananda himself generally would not give rise to a defamation counterclaim for the Institute and Yogaville. But the court does state that statements about the defendant's role in covering up the abuse could, if they were actually able to meet the above requirements. As the court reiterates that even the specific allegations against the defendants, such as calling them a cult, which is time barred anyway, and alleging that Sharon attacked them on a radio show, lack sufficient specificity. As the court stated, quote, because the third and fourth counterclaims were not pled with particularity, they fail to state a valid claim and therefore dismissal is proper, end quote. The ruling concludes with the following, quote, here, defendants have not identified what specific facts are in the plaintiff's control that are needed in order to show a substantial basis for their counterclaims. Most of the bases given for the counterclaims rely on statements about Satchidananda, not defendants, and most of the allegations of tortious behavior center around the alleged actions and statements of non-parties to the action, not plaintiffs. Defendants have not identified what facts or law would give rise to plaintiffs' vicarious liability for the alleged actions of others, outside of a vague statement regarding a conspiracy. Defendants have thus failed to meet their burden for discovery, because they have failed to identify what facts are in plaintiff's control and necessary in order to show a substantial basis for their counterclaim. Accordingly, it is hereby ordered and adjudicated that the plaintiff's motion to dismiss the counterclaim is granted, and it is further adjudicated that defendant's motion for discovery is denied, and it is further ordered that the plaintiffs may separately move for attorney's fees and costs upon proper documentation, and such will be awarded in an amount to be determined, end quote. So what exactly does this mean? 1, it means that Yogaville's counterclaim is fully dismissed, and that Susan and Sharon are going to be able to go after Yogaville for their attorney's fees for having to respond to such a blatant slap lawsuit. And 2, it means that Sharon and Susan's original lawsuit is going to go forward, and Yogaville is going to have to thoroughly respond to the allegations of Susan and Sharon. And in my opinion, you can clearly see that this counterclaim was built on a steaming pile of bullshit. And of course, the Supreme Court said that very eloquently, but what they essentially said is that there is nothing here and your claims are some bullshit. We're dismissing it. Have a nice day. But just to be clear, it's important to remember that this ruling pertains only to the dismissal of the defendant's counterclaims, so Integral Yoga's counterclaims against Susan and Sharon, and does not constitute a judgment on the plaintiffs, who are Sharon and Susan's original allegations of sexual abuse within their lawsuit. Those allegations in that case will more than likely go forward in a separate court, but at least now, Yogaville will be forced to answer to the claims against them. The law firm representing Sharon Norris and Susan Cohen, McAllister Oliverius, released a press release following the final decision of the court on January 29th, 2025, which reads the following, quote, in a landmark decision for survivors of historic sexual abuse, the New York State Supreme Court has thrown out an attempt to bring defamation claims against 2 women who filed allegations of sexual abuse under the Adult Survivors Act, a New York state law giving victims of sexual offenses a 1-year look-back window to file civil claims outside the statute of limitations. The case arose when Integral Yoga Institute Incorporated and Satchidananda Ashram Yogaville Incorporated, organizations associated with his homeliness, Swami Satchidananda, the luminary guru who gave the opening address at Woodstock in 1969, attempted to countersue two women who alleged they were sexually assaulted by the guru in a November 2023 complaint filed under the Adult Survivors Act. According to the November 2023 filing, the two women became involved with Swami Satchidananda and his Integral Yoga Institute in the late 60s and early 70s. Both women alleged they were assaulted by Swami Satchidananda, who regularly demanded oral and vaginal sex, while initiating them into a culture of complete surrender and subjugation. One plaintiff, who was invited to stand with Satchidananda on stage at both Conakry Hall and at Woodstock, alleges she was told to keep silent about the sexual abuse because the Swami was known as a, quote, publicly celibate, end quote, monk. Swami Satchidananda, who died in 2002, was not named in the original complaint, which instead listed Integral Yoga Institute Incorporated and Satchidananda Ashram Yogaville Incorporated as defendants. Both organizations denied the allegations and attempted to countersue the plaintiffs for defamation and tortious interference, arguing that certain alleged statements were defamatory and a conspiratorial attempt to financially ruin their organization. The plaintiffs moved to dismiss these counterclaims, asserting that the defamation lawsuit was an attempt to intimidate, silence, and exact revenge on them for filing their ASA lawsuit. The Honorable Judge Lyle E. Frank of the New York State Supreme Court agreed with them, ruling that the countersuit should be deemed a strategic lawsuit against public participation without substantial basis in law. As a result, the plaintiffs are entitled to recover attorney's fees. In the context of increasingly aggressive attempts to weaponize defamation laws, the case marks an important test for the ASA and other look-back windows that offer survivors of sexual assault a second chance at obtaining justice, and represents an important victory for the right to free speech by survivors of sexual assault, end quote. And Sharon and Susan's attorney, Pamela Kaufman, who is the head of sexual misconduct in spiritual communities practice at McAllister Oliverius, also made a statement in the press release stating, quote, "This ruling is a victory, not just for the plaintiffs, but for all survivors of sexual violence who have the courage to speak out. It sends a powerful and sorely needed message that those who seek to intimidate, silence, or punish survivors for telling the truth will not succeed," end quote. And as far as I know, this case is still progressing, but I wasn't able to find any public updates at this moment. But best believe Cam and I will be following this case, and we'll be sure to update you all as soon as we know any information about this case. So now, again, I know I just threw a crap ton of information at you, but I felt it was very important to go through all of the allegations in their entirety, the response in its entirety, and where the case sits right now in its entirety. And I think you'll understand why it was really important for me to go through all of that, because you remember how I mentioned that Swami Satchidananda, as well as Yogaville itself, had a connection with Doc Antle? Well, now Cam is going to break down for you what that connection is and why it is so important to explain all of the previous allegations.
So, like we mentioned, Doc Antle, who you may know from his appearance in the Tiger King documentary, was very involved in integral yoga and Yogaville from the early days. The documentary that followed Tiger King about Doc Antle uncovered accusations that he created a cult-like atmosphere at his zoo. Some of this may sound familiar. His former employees claim that, on top of hiring mostly women, Doc Antle required them to be single, childless, vegetarian, and adhere to a dress code. Before I get into this, I do want to give a disclaimer and trigger warning that I'm about to discuss allegations that Doc Antle had sexual relationships with underage girls, as well as allegations of domestic abuse. So, Doc Antle married his first wife, Betsy Rogers, who he met in high school, after they did a month-long retreat at Yogaville. However, this marriage did not last long. For one, Betsy said that Doc would tell the women/girls that he was sleeping with that he and his wife had an open relationship, but Betsy had not consented to this. I feel like there are a lot of men out here who are in open relationships that their partners don't know about.
Hello.
Anyways, Betsy alleged that Doc would abuse her by strangling her so that it wouldn't leave a mark. Soon after Betsy gave birth to his first child, Doc Antle, at the age of 22, allegedly began sleeping with a 15-year-old girl he met at Yogaville named Sumati Steinberg. Sumati would eventually go on to be his second wife. In the documentary, Betsy states that Doc lost interest in her after she stopped looking like a teenager. And apparently, Sumati had a similar experience with Doc. She said that he physically abused her multiple times throughout their marriage, sometimes to the point where she feared for her life. And when she became pregnant, he asked her to get an abortion. During Sumati's pregnancy, Doc began sleeping with Radha Hirsch while he was 25 and she was 14, according to Radha's testimony in the documentary. Doc allegedly abducted Radha when she was 15 and put her up in an Akono lodge outside of DC. In the documentary, Radha says that when she was a teenager, she just considered it running away, but now she understands the gravity of the situation. And I feel like this was especially apparent in retrospect when at one point Radha admitted to Doc that she contacted her mom to let her know that she was okay, and Doc made her cut her hair and moved her to his zoo in Virginia. Just normal things you do when you're helping a child run away and not abducting them.
Hello.
Doc and Radha would go on to get married after forging Radha's father's signature on the birth certificate, because when someone is that young, they can only get married with their parents' approval. Radha would soon get out of her marriage with Doc after he apparently admitted that he'd been attracted to her since she was 11. Outside of all of this nastiness, craziness, ickiness, in 2022, Doc Antle faced charges of wildlife trafficking and conspiracy to violate the Endangered Species Act. In October 2023, he was sentenced to 2 years of suspended prison time on the wildlife trafficking charges, and in November of 2023, he pleaded guilty to the charge of conspiring to violate the Endangered Species Act. He was set to be sentenced in August 2024, but that hearing got canceled, and I wasn't able to find any updates past that. Doc Antle responded to the documentary and all of its allegations, saying that the accusations were not true and were from, quote, colorful second and third tier characters from my long lost past, all of whom attempt to tell a tale that never happened, end quote.
Cases like this boil my blood more than anything else. Because I'm going to be very honest with you. If nobody knows, I'm only 27 years old. I went to a bar literally a week ago, and a young man who was wearing a Letterman jacket walked up to me and asked if he could buy me a drink. And I felt immense disgust at the idea that this child would come up to me and ask me if I wanted a drink. Mind you, he's wearing a Letterman jacket. I couldn't see a year on it, so he could have been a college student. I'm hoping he's a college student. We're in a bar, so hopefully he's 21, but we're not going to sit here and act like fake IDs aren't a thing. But I was repulsed even thinking about the idea this dude was maybe 19, 20, 21. Repulsed. Absolutely repulsed. And I'm in my late 20s. So when people make statements like, I've been attracted to you since you were 11, what is wrong with you? Do I care what's wrong with you? No. I'm going to be very honest. No. There are some people who I believe just need to be buried under a jail. And sorry, anybody who makes predatory movements against children are people who deserve to be buried under the jail, to me. And the thing that's so concerning about this is the fact that people like that only like young women because they can manipulate them. They only like people who don't have enough life experience to know that what this person is doing is wrong or weird or crazy. 14? 14, you have no life experience at 14. I don't know what you were doing at 14, Cam, but I was in cheer practice deciding whether or not I want to wear blue or yellow bloomers today. That was the height of decision making when I was 14. And you kidnapped a child force said child into a marriage, and then you have the audacity to say that nothing happened. And at least when it comes to Rada, there's at least documentation that you married a child. So you can't say that that didn't happen because there's documentation that you married a child. So I've gotten all my feelings out about like just people like Doc, people who prey on children. And now I'm going to actually transition to the topic of this episode, which is Yogaville, which is, I hope you guys at home felt as uncomfortable about the movements of Doc and Yogaville as I did, because he went to Yogaville to get these women.
Girls.
You're correct. He went out of his way to specifically go to Yogaville and get these girls. He went to a place that was already isolating them, that had already perfectly cut off their communication to their families and their outside world, and just served them up to him on a platter. And then institutes all these crazy rules for them, just like Swami Satchidananda did.
Exactly. Because if you have these teen girls staying in your center, you need to make sure that any interactions between them and any adult man or woman, because predators are not gender specific.
Hello.
Those interactions need to be supervised. But when the person or people supervising them are allowing other interactions to happen, I'm not even sure if I would trust that supervision. But that being said, in the first part, we talked a little bit about how Yogaville would have young girls come to the ashram and sort of study yoga, which could be a positive experience, especially in your teenage years. You're going through an emotionally tumultuous time, and something like yoga could be beneficial in helping you center those emotions and center your thoughts. This should not be the time when they are at risk of being sexually abused and trafficked, because that's what you're doing when you take a child away from her family.
Exactly. That is trafficking across state lines as well, which is a whole nother charge.
So we spent a lot of time, aka 90% of the episodes, talking about the negative aspects of Yogaville. But we also want to point out the positive aspects of it that draw people in and make it seem enticing.
And Cam is exactly right. We believe that in order to tell all sides of a story and be fair to all sides, we have to talk about those positive experiences with Yogaville or with cults in general. A person's experience at a place like Yogaville can be positive, even if the circumstances around it are not ideal. And here's a few reasons why. 1, people visit Yogaville for various reasons, such as seeking peace, reflection, spiritual inspiration, or a break from daily stress. And even if the external factors around Yogaville are very problematic and bad, the internal journey can still be very rewarding. 2, visitors can participate in daily schedules that include yoga, meditation, and scripture study. And they can also explore sacred sites and natural surroundings. And the availability of these options allows individuals to tailor their experience to their needs and preferences, and allows them to have designated time that they could see as self-care. 3, despite potential feelings of emptiness or a lack of guidance from the newer reviews of Yogaville, many visitors still describe it as a friendly place and an open atmosphere, where connecting with others, sharing stories, and experiencing a sense of community is very positive for them and can create positive memories. 4, ultimately, a visitor's experience depends on their mindset and openness to the present movement. Even amidst the allegations, individuals can find value in introspection, nature, and the pursuit of personal growth. And 5, simply understanding that it is possible to appreciate what one gets from a person or place, even if the place is based in a terrible origin. Often, cults are seen as simply bad, but the reality is so much more nuanced. To former members, cults can be dangerous and life-ruining, while current members may see them as a way of life and their identity. And even researchers have different views, with some considering cults strange but harmless, and others seeing them as systematically abusive. And I found this really great article. It will be linked in our sources for this episode that essentially explains that cults present what is called a quote, wicked problem, end quote. Wicked problems are complex and defy simple solutions, shifting depending on the perspective. They are difficult to define, lack a clear solution, and are essentially unique and have multiple explanations. One of the central issues is the conflict between individual freedom and the potential for harm when it comes to cults. Democratic societies, like in the United States, protect freedom of religion, but those beliefs might result from manipulation, indoctrination, or psychological abuse. Balancing the rights of individuals to believe what they want with the need to protect vulnerable people from exploitation is a difficult task. So to begin looking at everything from all sides, we must take into account the perspectives of ex-members and current members. Ex-members' perspectives are critical for understanding cults, even if you think they may be biased, as dismissing their experiences would be like ignoring a person's valid emotions. And ex-members provide vital insight into the experience of belonging to a cult, because I always think it's important to remember that at the end of the day, though they are now an ex-member, at one point, they were completely invested in the cult. They were a supporter. So I always think it's important to have the conversation of what led them away from that. It's also important to consider the perspectives of current members, but this in itself presents another challenge. Are current members in control of their own thinking? Are they being brainwashed and having their personhood suppressed? It can be difficult to determine whether current members are expressing their own ideologies or simply repeating the ideas from the leaders. And as cults vary in their level of control, with some cults exerting total control through isolation and coercion, others yield more moderate control. And it is important to recognize that not all groups that are labeled cults are inherently harmful or dangerous. Some may simply be strict religious organizations that the greater community or world simply doesn't understand. But despite the potential for harm and manipulation, people often join cults seeking belonging, protection, security, and meaning. Cults may fulfill a need for religious fulfillment, political activism, self-actualization, or a sense of community. And a person might find within a cult a sense of purpose, social competence, problem-solving skills, and a feeling of autonomy. But it is also important to keep in mind that cults can be harmful, not that they are inherently harmful, and they may employ manipulative tactics and negatively affect the mental and physical well-being of its members. These include physical and sexual abuse, starvation, humiliation, verbal and emotional abuse, tax evasion, immigration law violations, fraud, denying children appropriate education, acts of terror, or even murder. Psychological harm such as guilt, anxiety, depression, fear, insomnia, amnesia, or sexual dysfunction after leaving a cult. And difficulty integrating into society after you leave, especially in cases of children who were raised in cults. As an adult, they can face additional challenges, including the effects of abuse and neglect, attachment disorders, lack of education, and family relationship challenges. Growing up in a cult can lead to feelings of self-hatred, an inability to trust oneself, difficulty in making sound decisions, shame and guilt, and a sense of isolation. Despite these challenges, research shows that many individuals who experience significant risk factors in childhood are able to survive and create positive lives for themselves outside of the cult. Cult survivors can develop strengths such as social competence, problem-solving skills, autonomy, and a sense of purpose. So I think that just leads to one outstanding question, which is, what can we as a society do when it comes to cults? And reportedly, there are a number of things we as a society can do. One, we can acknowledge that cults are more than sensational stories. As you've heard me say before, all of our stories are real, with real people and real pain. Two, approach research on cults with skepticism, particularly research based on the cult's own assertions. Having open and real conversations about how cults leverage religious freedom to avoid scrutiny. Recognize the unique challenges for those born and raised in cults versus those who joined as an adult. And probably the most important thing we can do is promote awareness, share stories, and end the shame and stigma around cult experiences. As Cam and I have already stated, anyone is susceptible to becoming a member of a cult. Thus, without awareness and knowledge, you too open yourself up to live the same fate. Again, understanding cults is not an easy conversation to have, nor is it easy to understand, but the conversation needs to be had. And I just hope that over the last 2 episodes, you've been able to expand your mind and understand a little bit more about the cult structure and how it continues and grows. And Cam and I would love to see your thoughts on this aspect of the case and what you think we as a society can do. So be sure to leave us a comment on this episode. And we want to kind of conclude today's episode talking about leaving a cult. Earlier, I talked about how, yes, somebody can have positive experiences within a cult. In a bad situation overall, somebody can have positive experiences, but sometimes individuals take a moment to reflect and realize that the situation wasn't actually as positive as they thought. And as a result, that may require some deep introspection and beginning the process of deprogramming.
So the act of leaving a cult is usually referred to as cult deprogramming. And when it first became popular in the 70s, it specifically referred to a very coercive method aimed at reversing the effects of brainwashing and mind control used by cults. It would involve physically detaining a cult member and subjecting them to intense information and pressure with the goal of getting them to renounce their beliefs and reverse the cult's destructive mind control by controlling the information that they were receiving. Like I said, this was popular in the 70s, but this practice has since come under a lot of scrutiny for many reasons. 1, it's illegal to kidnap somebody and hold them against their will. 2, it's also considered disrespectful to their individual rights. 3, it can be traumatizing and do more harm than good. And 4, deprogramming can fail and lead to lawsuits against families and those leading the deprogramming. So the quote unquote father of modern cult deprogramming is a man named Ted Patrick. In the 70s, when his cult deprogramming method became popular, he basically believed and advocated that cult members were being brainwashed. So he developed deprogramming as a procedure to reverse the indoctrination methods being used by cults. He was known for his intense tactics, including kidnapping, which led to multiple arrests. He was kind of a person where he was like, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get this person out, even if whatever it takes is illegal. So just know that Ted Patrick's methods and actions are considered very controversial. So while the form of cult deprogramming that was popular in the 70s is very illegal and discouraged now, there are a few alternatives to deprogramming. Exit counseling, for one, is a non-coercive, legal option that respects a person's free will and is focused on providing information about cults and their destructive influence. There's also something called the strategic interactive approach that focuses on building positive relationships and empowering individuals to question and think critically about their involvement in cults. This aims to empower people by teaching them about social psychology, brainwashing, thought reform, and coercive control. Lastly, post-cult counseling empowers individuals to think critically, evaluate, reality test, and exercise their own free will. So now that I've stated the history of cult deprogramming and some of the alternatives, I want to get into someone specific named Rick Ross that we discussed in part 1. If you didn't listen to part 1 and you are this far in the episode, we've just accepted that you live life differently than us, and that's okay. But in part 1, we discussed Rick Ross as the person who helped out in the Catherine Chang story. And so right now I'm just going to get a little bit more into details about who he is and what his expertise is. So Rick Allen Ross not the same Rick Ross as the rapper Rick Ross, is the founder and executive director of the Cult Education Institute, which is where we found the Chang story and which contains a lot of information and testimonies related to cults across the world. Rick has been studying cults since 1982 and is considered to be an internationally known expert. Mans has a resume longer than a CVS receipt. He's testified as an expert witness in federal court proceedings, helped out law enforcement and government agencies, and helped out thousands of families with getting their loved ones out of cults. He's also been a paid consultant for networks like CBS and Disney, has appeared on shows like Dateline, Oprah, 48 Hours, and Inside Edition, and has lectured at universities across the world. Based on a video from the YouTube account Wired in November 2024, his approach to deprogramming is described as less abrasive than Ted Patrick's. He specifically recommends, when it comes to getting somebody out of a cult, not being critical, being a good listener, and keeping the lines of communication open with that person. To him, an intervention is a step that happens later in the process once the communication with that person has started. And according to him, the programming specifically should begin as a surprise or intervention where you're asking the person to unplug from their group for a certain period of time. I will clarify, this does not mean kidnap that person, but just like you would stage an intervention if somebody is addicted to alcohol or some other substance, you do want it to be a surprise so that they don't have time to consult with other people in the cult or warn them that it's happening. And he really breaks deprogramming down into 4 blocks of conversation. 1, defining a destructive cult, looking back at specific cult tragedies and drawing parallels to that person's situation. 2, defining coercive persuasion and drawing parallels to that person's experience. 3, calling out what the group may have hidden from them. And 4, presenting research about the group's history, finances, lawsuits, and criminal complaints. These interventions can last a few days, and he states that at the end, it's the person's decision to leave, stay, or take a break from the cult. He also did note that cult deprogramming is especially hard when it comes to deprogramming children or people who have been raised in a cult. And he notes that involuntary deprogramming is only legal if it's a minor and is done under the supervision of a parent or guardian. He does state that the last involuntary deprogramming he did was in 1990 and concedes that involuntary deprogramming of adults is indeed illegal. Now, in this Wired video, which I definitely recommend for people, something that I found interesting is that he distinguishes benign cults from destructive cults, which sort of harkens back to what Dev was explaining when she was talking about positive experiences with cults. And when he talks about benign cults, he gives examples like Apple, aka the phones most of us have, and Swifties as benign cults. Because while there may be a sort of cult of personality around a person or object or company, we're not necessarily being psychologically tortured or brainwashed to a certain extent. Another thing that he pointed out that I think is really interesting and would love to hear people's thoughts on is he also said that some abusive relationships can be considered cults because a cult only needs one follower. And in those relationships, the abusive party is the leader and their partner is the follower. He also describes some of the deprogrammings that he participated in. One of the most interesting was when he deprogrammed people who were part of the Waco Davidians, which was a doomsday cult, and he described how they were really frantic to get back into the compound. And you can imagine when you're being raised in a cult where you're told that the end is coming and the only way to come out on the other side in a positive way is to stay in this cult, that pulling somebody out of that situation is an extremely traumatic situation. And another thing he said that matches with what we've said is that all major cults have an online presence, YouTube channels, and search engine optimization so that they show up first when you search for anything related to what they're doing. And he says another thing that links back to something I said when I was talking about the psychology of cult members. He says, quote, "People don't join cults. They join movements and groups that they think are good," end quote. And I think that's just something we've got to keep in mind. Somebody doesn't join a cult thinking, oh, yeah, I'm joining a cult. It's going to be fun. I'm going to get brainwashed. No, they join groups that they think have good intentions and they think will have a positive impact on them.
I really admire the approach that he has taken because I very much agree that even in cases of interventions, if you're dealing with like maybe a loved one who is dealing with addiction or something like that, it is kind of treated like a this is our last resort to help you kind of thing. And I appreciate that he looks at cult behavior the same way. And at the end of the day, whether you like it or not, specifically some parents out there, adults are allowed to make decisions for themselves. Even your adult children who may be in a cult and you feel like it's bad for them, they're allowed to make their own decision, even if you don't like it. So I admire the approach. I do think it is less abrasive. And again, similarly to how I stated earlier and how Cam has mentioned before too, I feel like the only way to actually help people in cults or to have dialogues about cults that are productive is to talk about it in a way of not shaming, of understanding, of I understand exactly how you got into this. Even the doomsday cults out there, or even the cults that do murder and stuff like that, I could always understand why somebody got in the first place. Because like Cam was saying, and like Rick was saying, nobody's like, oh yeah, I'm going to join this doomsday cult. They're going to take all my possessions, sell everything, and I'm going to sit here on a compound. And, you know, that's the vibes. That's not what this is about. That's not how people usually get into that sort of thing. And coming with that level of understanding, I think is really smart and genuine and actually in a way that is helpful. And so I admire this approach. This is an approach I could get behind.
Now, let's get into some of Rick Ross's legal troubles. As we've already stated, cult-like organizations are very litigious. They don't like to be called cults. They don't like for people to be saying what they are doing behind closed doors. And they will shut that down as much as they can and as quickly as they can. So Rick Ross, being someone who professionally deals with trying to get people out of cults and going after cults, you can imagine has had his fair share of legal trouble. Specifically, he was sued by NXIVM in 2003. NXIVM, who most of us know as a cult disguised as a self-help organization, considered Rick Ross to be enemy number one. So NXIVM filed a lawsuit against Rick Ross, accusing him of publishing protected materials without authorization. He, in turn, accused NXIVM of conducting background checks on him, including obtaining his banking records, social security information, and personal relationships. I'm not going to get too much into this. Eventually, the case was dismissed, but I did want to just end the episode with something that I found really funny. So in this same Wired video, Rick Ross describes Keith Raniere, who was the leader of NXIVM, as, quote, a strange little man that looked like a garden dwarf, end quote. And he said, quite frankly, he stank. I don't know if he ever took a shower. When he walked into the courtroom, he had an aura, but it wasn't anything charismatic. It was just a bad aroma. And I just think that is the funniest way to describe a cult leader.
No, but this goes back to Yogaville and say, don't you wear no perfumes on this? Oh, that's hilarious.
Like, how you coming to court stinking?
Come on now. You gotta shower before court. Court and church are the two times you gotta shower. Dude, that is so funny to me because also he's right. And at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that most people who start a cult are like insecure, tiny little people who just want to be validated by external sources. So I actually love this definition. Let's stop calling them cult leaders and let's start calling them cult dwarves.
Yes.
I think that
cult gnomes. Yeah.
Cult garden gnomes. Please, let's add that to Urban Dictionary. Cult garden gnome. Oh goodness, that's horrible. That's hilarious. That was a perfect way to end this episode, friend.
So you've heard a lot from us about Yogaville and other cult related things. But we actually had the chance to sit down with a former member of Yogaville, Brianna Patton, and ask her questions about her experience both in and outside the cult. If you're interested in tuning into that conversation and learning even more about what it's like to be in a cult and leave a cult, definitely stay tuned because we'll be releasing that interview next week. However, if you are already subscribed to our Patreon, that interview is already available. So just go on and hop on over to our Patreon and take a listen.
Next time on the Criminalish podcast.
So here today with us, we have Brianna Patton, who is the creator and host of the Surviving Satchidananda podcast, a podcast that goes into her experience at Yogaville as well as other former members' experience at Yogaville. So, Brianna, we gave you a bit of an intro already, but we'd love for our listeners to hear your story in your own words. Can you explain who you are and your journey?
Sure. My name's Brianna, and when I was 21 years old and on a gap year from college, I went to this place called Yogaville, intending to just stay there for a month and do a month-long 4-week yoga immersion. And I ended up staying for about 4 years.
So you guys just saw a sneak peek of our interview with Brianna. And if you would like early access to that interview, again, you can jump over to the Criminalish Patreon to get early access to episodes and bonus content that focuses more on the things me and Cam like to talk about, including current events and reactions. So be sure to check out our Patreon if you would like exclusive access to everything I just mentioned. See y'all in Cell Block C. And as an extra motivation for you, beginning this season, we will begin having all of our Patreon supporters be in the end credits of every single one of our YouTube videos. And that's our special little way of thanking you guys for supporting your favorite true crime duo. So if you would like to support us and see your name in every single one of our videos, come join us in Cell Block C.
So this was our first cult episode, but we definitely don't want it to be our last. So listeners, watchers, let us know what questions you have. Let us know if there are other cults that you want us to cover on this podcast. Dev and I are both interested in cults just in our free time. So we definitely want to cover more of these stories and specifically put a spotlight on the pain and suffering that these organizations can cause to their members.
As we wrap up today's discussion, we're going to move into our segment called Today in Crime, where we'll describe a crime or crime-related event that took place on this day. On April 25th, 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan changed its municipal water supply source from Detroit-supplied Lake Huron water to the Flint River. This decision came after Flint fell under state control in 2013, and an emergency manager was appointed to cut city costs. Ending the city's 5-decade practice of piping treated water from Detroit was seen as a cheaper alternative, intended to be temporary until a new water pipeline was completed. However, inadequate treatment and testing of the Flint River water caused water distribution pipes to corrode, allowing lead and other contaminants into the drinking water. Residents soon complained about foul-smelling, discolored, and off-tasting water, reporting issues like skin rashes, hair loss, and itchy skin. Despite these complaints, officials initially maintained that the water was safe. Studies later revealed a significant spike in the citywide lead levels, with the incidence of elevated blood lead levels in children nearly doubling, and in some cases, tripling. Approximately 9,000 children were supplied with lead-contained water for 18 months. Exposure to lead can cause serious health impacts, especially in children, including impaired brain development, reduced IQ and physical growth, anemia, hearing impairment, cardiovascular disease, and behavioral problems. The Flint water crisis continues to affect residents today in several ways. Although lead levels have remained below the federal action level for the past 7 years, as of April 2024, the city has not met court-ordered deadlines to replace all lead service pipelines. This means potentially hundreds of residents are still receiving water through lead pipes. Property damage caused by the pipe replacement program also still requires repairs for nearly 2,000 homes. The The slow pace of progress has led to future legal action, for a federal court recently finding the city in contempt for failing to meet pipe replacement deadlines. While a major settlement in 2003 provided $626 million for the civil lawsuits, no individuals in power have faced criminal penalties. The crisis also eroded residents' trust in government agencies. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration is supporting 5-year follow-up activities to promote resilience, focusing on youth and families, trauma, behavioral health disparities, and community engagement. If you found this story interesting, please leave a water emoji in the comments.
And even though the criminal charges against people like the governor, the emergency manager, and I believe the person in charge of the water department were dropped, we still found it important to talk about this story for our Today in Crime segment, because not only did they make the decision to switch to a different water flow for residents based solely on the cost, they did not do the due diligence to make sure that the water that they were switching to was clean. And Flint River was historically known for being unclean. This was a river where you had a lot of waste runoff. Lumber mills, different types of factories were dumping their waste into this river. So it doesn't really make sense to me that you would switch your water source to being this dirty ass river and not make sure you're doing the work to ensure it's clean. I guess it doesn't make sense to me because I care about people. But I guess if I were to put myself in the head of somebody who doesn't care about people, especially people who don't look like them, then I guess it makes sense. But it's like, y'all didn't even do the due diligence. And then when people started coming to you saying, hey, this water is not clean, I think this water is making me sick, you literally gaslit them and were like, nah, it's clean, continue drinking it.
Because that's the part that does it for me, girl. It's the doubling down. It's the doubling down. And again, it's not only just the fact that you literally made this change solely based on ones and zeros, but also as somebody who deals with stormwater management quite a bit, who deals with contaminated rivers quite a bit, who that is actively part of my job. The timeline of which this all got done told me you guys didn't do any kind of research. You did not talk to any kind of water waste manager. You did not contact any engineers to make sure that this was appropriate. That tells me zero due diligence was done, just the speed of which it happened. If you don't know, I work as an urban planner, so I do a lot of developments, specifically out here with wetland developments and where we can and can't move water, where we can and can't pull water from. It is a daily conversation in my office. And there's no way that those permits got through and that research and due diligence was done if it happened as quickly as it did.
Exactly. And I'm glad that they at least have support from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Organization for the next 5 years, but it's going to take a lot longer than that.
Exactly. And especially because at this point, people are going to have lifelong health issues in related to you guys allowing them to drink that dirty ass water for 18 months. That's going to affect somebody for the rest of their life because you refused to do any initial due diligence. And then when people came to you and said things were wrong, you didn't stop it immediately. People's lives will be forever changed because they were poisoned by their own city. And let's call it what it is.
Exactly. And, you know, we assume that the tap water that we get from our faucets, at the very least, is safe. It may not be tasty, especially for those living in Florida. I don't like Florida tap water.
Your girl doesn't drink Florida tap water. I would never put that shit in my body.
But if you were to put that in your body, it at least would not cause lifelong health problems.
Exactly.
And because we live in a society where we pay taxes to provide the infrastructure that supports our lives, that assumption should always be true. But we're entering into an era where a lot of those things that we take for granted, that we assume will be provided, are in question. And I hope for all of our listeners and for ourselves as well that we are opening ourselves up to our community and making sure that you know your neighbors, that you have strong relationships with your friends, because to get through this next administration, we are going to have to rely on each other. I understand why Flint residents don't trust the government anymore. And it's very understandable that increasingly Americans across the country are losing trust in our government. So Now it's time for us to place that trust in our community.
Absolutely couldn't have been any more beautifully said, friend.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode. We used an extensive list of sources, too many to name, but we will include a link to these sources in the episode description. However, if you want to check out photos related to part 2 of Yogaville and our Today in Crime story, follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube.
Listeners, if you like what you hear, be sure to leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish Podcast. And if you're listening on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to our channel and feel free to leave any comments or questions. As always, stay nosy, my friends. Bye.
Bye.